Sammy Baugh may well be the GOAT, or at the very least, I think he was somebody that was once in the conversation, but eventually got a little bit lost to time when bigger names like Peyton Manning, Tom Brady and Joe Montana rose to dominance. But what if you were, at least at one time, considered to be the greatest to ever do it before all of those names were even born? Even more so, what if at one time you were considered to be the greatest to ever do it at multiple positions? What if you might even still be the greatest to ever do it at one of those positions, which is even primarily not what you are known for? Do you transcend the typical GOAT status or the GOAT conversation? Are you no longer in the conversation of the GOAT quarterback or tailback at the time, but more so, the greatest pure football player of all time? Let's talk about slinging Sammy Baugh. But who the heck even was Sammy Baugh? Born in Temple, Texas in 1914, Sammy Baugh eventually moved to Sweetwater, Texas after his parents' divorce early into his life, in which, within that town, he played quarterback in high school. To practice, Sammy would actually run around and swing a tyre to strengthen his throwing arm and mobility. And despite a clear talent for football, he actually preferred to pursue baseball in his early years. He actually almost went to college in Washington State on a baseball scholarship until he suffered a knee injury 1 month before his college years were supposed to start, which ruined that opportunity. Instead, he played football at TCU and was nominated All-American in 1935 and 1936. He won 2 bowl games and finished 4th in Heisman Trophy voting in 1936. At the end of his college career, he was drafted by the Washington Redskins, where then owner George Preston Marshall offered him $4,000 to play. Baugh accepted after the college All-Star game where they actually beat the Packers 6-0. The best college players back in the day used to play against the NFL for a game each year, which is crazy, and they would get absolutely rattled if they did that today, which is hilarious. But I might do a video on those college All-Star games as well. But to further understand Sammy Baugh's significance, you have to actually understand what the sport was like at the time of his entry. Because let's be honest with ourselves, the numbers which I'm showing on screen now don't really scream GOAT, I admit that. They seem more Jamarcus Russell on the surface, but you'll just have to kind of bear with me whilst I explain just how Sammy Baugh was actually the Tom Brady of his era, and even more so, he was probably the first ever football star. Entering the league, Sammy joined the Washington Redskins team in their first year removed from being the Boston Redskins. The team were decent enough and waved goodbye to Boston with a 7-5 record and a 21-6 loss against the Green Bay Packers in the championship game. They didn't really have an identity and they had no edge over the competition. But enter Sammy, joining the league where the culture was pure ground game, because that's what football was at the time. The forward pass was not only a rare occurrence, but it was actively discouraged anywhere outside of the 30-yard line. You might think of this as a bit of a stupid concept, especially considering nowadays with the idea of the forward pass. I mean, that's just pretty much the entire identity of the sport. It's difficult to imagine a time where this was the inverse, but almost 100 years earlier, this was the case. And this begins to make a little bit more sense when we look at the shape of the ball back then. You should be seeing it on screen now. I mean, they were far from the rounder balls that you see in the early days of football back in the kind of late 1800s. But it was still wider and it was far more bulkier than the modern day balls now. To throw the ball and build your philosophy entirely around the concept of throwing rather than the safe traditional rush at the time did seem like the logical option. But at the time of his entry in the league, nobody had seen anybody throw a ball like Sammy. I mean, they didn't call him Slinging Sammy for nothing. Sammy, shape of the ball or not, could sling it, and they let him sling it. In only his rookie season, Sammy Baugh led the league in attempts, completions, yards, touchdown percentage, yards per attempt, adjusted yards per attempt, yards per catch, and yards per game. These stats alone show how alien the philosophy of throwing the ball was in the league. But above this, Sammy also won the NFL championship in his rookie year with 335 yards, 3 touchdowns, and a 107.5 rating. I mean, that's insane. I mean, that's like modern day numbers almost 100 years ago. And all in 1 year, where Sammy's phenomenal arm pretty much revolutionised the game as we know it today. Because that's right, Sammy Baugh actually was the man who revolutionised the forward pass in the professional league. And with that, he might actually be the most influential player of all time. I mean, without Sammy, where would we even be right now? I suppose Travis Etienne would have done a lot better on fantasy this year. But apart from that, I mean, where else? But influence isn't the only thing that you need to be the GOAT. You need a proven history of dominance and, of course, championships. Okay, with Sammy Baugh, there's championships and there's championship losses. A low point for Sammy Baugh was actually in the 1940 championship game where he lost 73-0 to the Bears. And this is still the most lopsided score in NFL history, even though the Broncos did try really hard to break this record against Miami a few years ago. When asked about a touchdown drop by the reporters after this 73-0 loss, he was asked if the touchdown would have made any difference to the outcome of the game. And Sammy Baugh actually responded, yeah, it would have made this 73-7, which, I don't know, I found that pretty funny. But let's be honest, to be considered within the GOAT conversation, you need that standout year. You need a year like Brady's 2007 year, or you need a year like Peyton Manning's 2013 year. You need something like Sammy Baugh's 1943. Okay, so I've tried to kind of figure out the best way to approach this season that truly demonstrates the level of dominance I'm about to discuss. So I think the best way to do that is to split into 3 sections. Okay, so as I've kind of established before, and I'll continue to establish, Sammy Baugh dominated the passing statistics this year, much like he did pretty much every year. He actually led the league in attempts, completions, and completion percentage. He threw for over 20 touchdowns this year, 23, which doesn't sound like much, but trust me, this was a lot back in the day. Yep, you read that right. I'm going to discuss punting a lot more later on, but punting. Sammy Baugh actually led the league in punting yards, punting attempts that year, yards per punt, and he also had the longest punt of the season within the league of 81 yards, which is just insanity. I mean, 81 yards is a hell of a long punt in any era, even modern era. But the more insane part of that 81-yard punt was it wasn't even his best. I mean, this was child's play for Slinging Sammy, and more on that and more on punting a little bit later on. Yeah, you read that right, defence as well. I mean, Sammy was all over the field throughout his entire career, and I doubt he even had the opportunity to take a break or have a cigarette on the sideline or whatever it was these old athletes would do during their free time. He actually had 11 interceptions that year in 1943, and this is and probably will always be amongst the highest ever caught within a season. The highest actually was Night Train Lane with 14. Then there's a few guys like Lester Hayes with 13. Then there's a few more with like Paul Krause with 12. And then there's Slinging Sammy amongst the likes of like Mal Blunt and more recently Trayvon Diggs. In short, you didn't want to throw the ball towards Sammy's direction. Because ironically, for as much work as he did to popularise the forward pass, it's almost like he kind of jumped onto defence to kind of level things out a little bit. Now, those stats alone are impressive enough, but I feel like the culmination of all of this came together on November the 14th, 1943. In this game, Sammy actually threw for 350 yards and 4 touchdowns. Again, just modern numbers, you might think. But I also should mention he had 4 interceptions. Not thrown, though, caught. This is actually tied for the NFL record for most interceptions caught within a game. And it's within the likes of like D'Angelo Hall in the early 2000s, which is just absolutely crazy. In fact, Sammy Baugh actually would frequently play on both sides of the ball, as I kind of mentioned before briefly. He actually finished with 31 interceptions, and all of those were within the years of 1940 to 1945. He was one of the greatest all-around athletes of all time, and over the remainder of his career, he also led the league in completion percentage for 8 years throughout his career, which is actually 50% of his total career. Passing yards per game, he actually led the league 5 times as well, which is almost halfway. A fun practice to see kind of how much his approach towards the forward pass revolutionised the game is to actually look at the fact that in both 1947 and 1948, he led the league in pass attempts with 354 and 314 attempts, respectively. Then if you compare that to how he led the league in attempts in his rookie year in the late 1930s, he actually led the league with 171 attempts. So it kind of shows how much his kind of approach ramped up those pass attempts. I mean, and Sammy even coached, and okay, we're not going to make the argument that he was the greatest coach of all time, but I think even just him coaching, again, just adds to that crazy story of Sammy Baugh. I mean, he was unbelievably versatile and unbelievably talented. Like a lot of players back then, he kind of played at several points on the field and on both sides of the ball. I mean, I'm not going to say he was the only player to ever kind of play in multiple positions. I mean, even Deion Sanders did. Deion Sanders played countless positions. But the key detail is how he absolutely dominated in every single position he played. And there's an argument that he was the best at the time, of all time. But what is a GOAT without records? And Sammy Baugh has some pretty notable records. I mean, there's some typical ones that he was the 4th player ever to throw for over 400 yards in a game. He also held the record for most passing yards within a game, which was 446, which, I mean, again, if you compare that to the modern day, is rare for a kind of player to do that. It's not impossible. Players do it quite a lot, but it's not frequent, you know. Then there's the fact that he holds the record for the most seasons with the league's lowest interception percentage. And it's just 5 seasons, by the way. He also held the record for some time of the highest completion percentage within a season. This was in 1940. He had a 70.3% completion percentage. But then there's 1940 in itself as well, where he had a punting average of 51.4 yards per season. That record actually held for a long time, and it only recently got broken in 2022 by Ryan Stonehouse. He also holds the record for the highest average punt yards throughout his career. And if you kind of take that stat yearly as well, he has the 2nd highest and the 5th highest best still, I mean, of all time, by the way. He also held the record for the longest punt for 7 years. He had a 85-yard punt, which eventually got broken, but he still had an 85-yard punt, which is insanity, and that's still the 12th longest punt of all time. He also is 29th with his 2nd longest punt, which was 81 yards. And a cool little side note about that. He also may be the most interesting stat, in my opinion, is a very early Triple Crown winner. But he didn't get the Triple Crown for kind of stats within a similar category like Cooper Kupp did with yards, receptions and touchdowns. He had the Triple Crown in that 1943 season for passing, punting and interceptions, which is just pretty much very insane to me. I know I've said insane a lot, but look into Sammy Baugh. I hope I'm doing it justice. In the history of big-time GOAT contenders at every position, like Deion Sanders at corner, Jerry Rice at receiver, Tony Gonzalez at tight end, I feel like it's very easy to forget the original GOAT, and it's very easy to overlook just the utter dominance like this as we've kind of moved further from that date. But Sammy Baugh was the original GOAT, and he was the original GOAT for a long time. He was the GOAT for many years, and there's an argument that he's still the greatest punter of all time. I know there's a lot of other fantastic punters, but you just look at the level of dominance that he had at the time and the consistency. He's up there. He might even be top 5, maybe. He's up there. And I feel like there's a comparison we can make with the modern game is the excitement that we're all currently feeling about Travis Hunter in this year's draft. A freak athlete which can go anywhere and seemingly do anything. I mean, tell me if that sounds familiar. So when Travis Hunter is drafted, I don't want to see any draft comparisons like Deion Sanders or any other. Like, I'm trying to think of players that may play multiple positions. Bo Jackson, I want to see draft comparisons to Sammy Baugh. I mean, if you look at it this way, Sammy Baugh is the Travis Hunter of the 1940s. I know I said it's the Tom Brady, but he's the Travis Hunter of the 1940s, and in a much more primitive version of the game. I mean, he thrusted it that little bit closer to the modern era with just his style and his talent, and the fact that he's shown that you can throw the ball and make your whole philosophy around throwing the ball rather than ground and pound game. And after that very long ramble and rant and comparison of Travis Hunter to Sammy Baugh, that's pretty much it. That's why I think Sammy Baugh, to me, is, if not the GOAT, amongst the GOATs. He's in the GOAT farm, Thank you for watching. Side note, my girlfriend got me this for Christmas, which I'd recommend for anybody that loves anything about NFL history, which clearly I do. And look who is on the front. Well, towards the front. Oh my god, where is it? It's not Peyton Manning, but I can't it is. Sammy Baugh. There he is with Peyton Manning, having a little orange juice. Nice.